On December 4th, 1927, the New York Times posted a newspaper clipping exhibiting the opposition that some Texans had against the proposal of having a limit on how many Mexican immigrants can come into the United States. The article states that Texans will fight quota on Mexicans. They declare influx of foreign labor is necessary for the prosperity of the state. What does it mean to have a quota on Mexicans? And why is there a need of a quota for Mexico if their labor is very much needed? How about we first start off with adding a little bit of background information on what it means to have a quota on a certain group. So on May 26, 1924, the Immigration Quota Act, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act, was passed into law, which created a restriction to the number of immigrants that can immigrate into the United States. This act created a quota or a set limit on groups of immigrants coming from the Eastern Hemisphere. But even with this immigration control, the act still showed some preference over other ethnic groups. For example, the United States granted plenty of Northern and Western European countries like Great Britain and Northern Ireland a limit of 65,721. This region had the highest quota compared to other countries presented in the table. There is nothing noted in the table on Mexico or any other Latin American country on having a quota for them. The reason behind the United States starting a quota law for immigrants is because it was seen as a means to protect the country's ideals and institutions from having an outside influence, as there is an influx of immigrants from countries that may have contrasting ideas and institutions from the U.S. In the Johnson-Reed Act, there was no explicit mention on Latin American countries and implementing a quota in these countries. When doing the research component for this project, there was several categories that influenced the decision on immigration population limits. One of the categories that influenced the decision of the quotas was the 1890 census and the selection of their place of origin. When it came to evaluating place of origin and determining quota, the goal was that those countries that had more immigrants flowing into the United States would have a larger quota. Because there was such a large amount of Latin American immigrants, the Congress decided not to set a limit for these countries and instead decided to just have border control along the southern border. This is because it would mean that the countries of people of color would have had been much higher than the desirable European countries and would then decrease the number of European immigrants they can accept. Therefore, the government created certain exclusionary criteria groups. So their census data will not be included within quota. Here are the following groups.
1. Immigrants from Western Hemisphere or the descendants. 2. Aliens ineligible to citizenship or their descendants. 3. The descendants of slave immigrants. Or 4. The descendants of the American Aborigine.
The first criteria group can be connected to those immigrants that come from Latin American countries, since they are from the Western Hemisphere. By the year 1927, the United States had a limit of 150,000 immigrants that can come through the Immigration Quota Act. Therefore, the United States Congress had to be very attentive to the national origins that they will be counting from, because the more countries they add to the Quota Act, the fewer immigrants they can allow from their favorite countries. Another category that influenced the decision of the quota law was this uncertainty of where the Latino race fell in the United States.
But not only did agricultural interests in the Southwest and diplomatic and business interests in Latin America impede restrictions on immigration from Mexico, Mexicans resisted easy racial classifications because they fit no clear type.
There was a much-needed request for these immigrants' labor, and they were technically considered as ethnically white, but they were so much different than what Caucasian or white meant to the United States. Mexicans did not fit in the black and white narrative that they are so used to, because the Mexican race had a little bit of everything. This group had a mix of indigenous, black, and white Spaniards inside of their blood. Struggling to label the Mexican race,
the borderlanders constructed Mexicans as more or less black or more or less white. They are in-between people without a clear place in a racial order grounded in the black-white divide.
With these types of categories that impeded the United States from enacting a restriction on Latin American immigration, the only way that they could try to prevent the number of immigrants coming into the United States is by imposing a border control officer in the southern border. In the year 1925, the United States was able to establish the U.S. Border Patrol, which was used widely in order to monitor the immigration movement coming from Latin America. Therefore, the United States strategically decided to exclude Latin American countries in their Quota Act in order to ensure that they focus on the desirable countries and ensure that they still have a flow of cheap labor into the country.